At dinner, my sister toasted, "Cheers to the Wilsons, except Emily, the family failure who only has money." My parents laughed. So I raised my glass and said, "Here's to the failure who just canceled your wedding fund." Today, a profound calm fills my home. The afternoon sun, streaming through the window, paints a scene of peace I once deemed unattainable. I inhale deeply, and the air no longer sears my lungs. Yet, not long ago, the very air within these walls, the sanctuary meant to be mine, felt suffocating. Everything shifted, or perhaps reached its peak, on that particular evening. My name is Elena. I am 35. To the outside world, I am largely seen as a successful woman. My event planning business, specializing in weddings and quinceañeras, has been featured in magazines. I earn a comfortable living and reside in a pleasant apartment in a desirable part of Mexico City. However, for the Hernandez family, I was simply the one who fell short. Why? Because in their view, at 35, I remained unmarried, without children, and entirely devoted to my career, instead of securing a good partner and establishing a proper family. What they conveniently overlooked or chose to ignore was that this failure had been the family's financial backbone for years. I funded my younger sister Lucy's college education because they believed in her potential. I provided the down payment for her first car, as she needed independence. I covered Dad's substantial medical bills when our insurance was inadequate. I recall that terrifying night in the emergency room when his chest pain left us all fearful. The hospital administrator approached me first, not my mother, with forms and payment inquiries. Even in that moment of fear, I was identified as the financial support. I helped them settle debts I never quite understood how they acquired. Credit cards mysteriously maxed out. Loans I only learned about when they needed bailing out. I never questioned the reasons behind these financial crises. They were family, and family supports family. This was my guiding principle. I believed in family with a fervor that now brings me embarrassment. I thought love meant sacrifice, that giving would strengthen our bonds, and that one day they would value me beyond my bank account. I thought if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, they would finally acknowledge me. How naive I was, clinging desperately to the fantasy of being appreciated when all they saw was a convenient ATM with unlimited withdrawals. Lucia and Miguel's engagement dinner became the ideal stage for the final act of that family drama. My parents' house sparkled. Mom had spent weeks preparing, calling me almost daily for financial contributions. "Elena, we need to rent the special chairs," she would say. Or, "Elena, Miguel's family expects premium champagne, not the usual kind." Each call ended with a bank transfer notification on my phone. Mom had gone to great lengths, fixated on making everything appear flawless for Miguel's family, who came from a respectable background, the kind of family my parents had always hoped to associate with, affluent, traditional, with old wealth and established names. Flowers were everywhere. Imported lilies and orchids I had paid for, arranged by the expensive florist Mom insisted was the only acceptable choice. Candles flickered in crystal holders purchased specifically for the occasion using my credit card. And that unmistakable fragrance of Mom's special paella wafted through the air, a recipe she had learned at the cooking class I had given her last Christmas, a dish she only prepared for grand events. The ingredients, of course, had been delivered earlier that day, charged to my account. Laughter and conversations filled the dining room, creating a bubble of apparent happiness, a perfect facade that had cost me nearly 3 months of my company's profits. Everyone was there. Dad, in his new suit that I paid for, carved the serrano, ham like the proud patriarch he perceived himself to be, offering pats on the back and old jokes. Mom, elegant, poured wine with a strained smile, hinting at the difficulties of organizing everything. Uncles, cousins, admired Lucia's ring, congratulating her effusively. Lucia herself was radiant, as always. My sister, the family's darling, with her flawless smile, her immaculate hair, and her fiancé Miguel by her side, gazing at her as if she were a goddess. They discussed the wedding, the plans, the honeymoon, plans that I knew would largely come from my funds. They had decided to spare no expense, the finest venue, the most expensive catering, the trendiest music band, and I, the failure, would foot the bill. I sat in a corner of the long table, trying to smile, nodding, answering superficial questions. I felt that familiar pang in my stomach, that sensation of being physically present but emotionally detached, like a paid guest in my own family's narrative. Every compliment directed at Lucia, every mention of the wedding, served as a reminder of my secondary role, that of the wealthy sister who sponsors but does not participate in true life. The underlying tension, invisible to Miguel and his family, but palpable to anyone familiar with the Hernandez family, vibrated in the air. It was as if we all walked on eggshells, smiling, knowing that at any moment something could shatter. And that night, it did. The moment for the formal toast arrived. Dad cleared his throat and raised his glass, speaking the expected words about future happiness. Then it was Lucia's turn. She rose in her silk dress, which I had also purchased, and lifted her glass with that smile that could charm anyone. The dining room fell silent, expectant. And then she uttered words that seared into my soul like acid. Cheers to the Hernandez family, to our family, to successes, to the future, to love. Cheers to everyone. She paused, her gaze finding mine across the table, and her smile widened cruelly. Except for Elena, of course. The failure of the family who only has money. A momentary tense silence hung in the air, and then the laughter of my parents, a sharp, derisive sound that echoed like breaking glass within me. Mom let out a cackle and nodded. Dad chuckled and patted Lucia's arm. Some uncles laughed nervously, not fully grasping the cruelty, but following the family's lead. I felt as if I were drowning. My chest tightened, as if barbed wire had been wrapped around my lungs. Lucia's words were no joke. They were a public humiliation, sanctioned by my own parents. In that instant, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just pain, it was an icy rage, a brutal clarity. I saw my entire history with them unfold before my eyes. The ignored sacrifices, the veiled contempt, the constant exploitation. Who only has money? That was my definition to them. Not my effort, not my professional achievements, not my unwavering support, just the money I provided. I lowered my glass, then raised it slowly again. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice when I spoke was surprisingly firm, clear. It silenced all the laughter. And I said, my voice resonating in the now complete silence of the dining room. I looked directly at Lucia, then at my parents, whose smiles had frozen on their faces. I toast to the failure. I paused. The tension was palpable. I could smell the incipient fear mixed with the aroma of paella and the flowers. I finished my toast with terrifying calm. To the failure! Who will stop paying for your wedding? The reaction was instantaneous. There were no laughs now. There was a sepulchral silence, broken only by the sound of someone coughing uncomfortably. My parents' and Lucia's faces paled. Their eyes widened in disbelief, then in anger. Miguel looked utterly bewildered. No one spoke. The atmosphere became dense, oppressive. The Hernandez family's perfect happiness bubble had burst into 1,000 fragments. I placed the glass on the table carefully. I stood up. Everyone watched me. I could feel the weight of 100 eyes. The house where I grew up suddenly felt foreign. Every family photo on the wall seemed like an accusation. Excuse me, I said, my voice still low but firm. It seems I've lost my appetite. I left the dining room, the house, without looking back. The cold night air was a relief on my burning face. I got into my car and drove aimlessly for a while, Lucia's words and my parents' laughter repeating in my head like a cruel, endless echo. My chest was still tight, but beneath the pain, a strong, clear rage grew. It was no longer just pain, it was resolve. I arrived at my apartment and collapsed on the sofa. The framed photos on my wall, pictures of family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, now seemed to mock me. In one, Lucia and I stood arm in arm at her college graduation, both smiling. I had been so proud that day, feeling I had helped her achieve something important. Now, the photo felt like evidence of my own blind devotion to a family mythology I had fabricated in my mind. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down my face and soaking the collar of my expensive blouse, another item I had bought to impress my family at the dinner, to somehow prove I wasn't the failure they believed I was. I wept for the girl who always craved her parents' approval. For the little Elena who would bring home perfect grades only to have them casually glanced at while Lucia's mediocre accomplishments were lavishly celebrated. I cried for the sister who believed in the bond of blood, who defended Lucia against childhood bullies and later paid her debts without question. I cried for the woman who allowed herself to be exploited, who had measured her worth by how much she could give, how much she could endure. I cried for the humiliation, for the injustice, for years of unseen sacrifices. I cried until no tears remained, until exhaustion left me empty. But in that emptiness, something new began to emerge. A resolution, cold and hard as a diamond. I was not going to be the failure anymore. I was not going to be the wallet. I was not going to let them walk all over me. My failure in their eyes was my freedom for me, and my money, which they so disdained when it came from me but coveted so much when it went to them, would become my instrument. The phone began to ring, messages and calls. I ignored the first round. My phone vibrated incessantly throughout the night, illuminating the darkness of my bedroom every few minutes. By morning, I had 37 missed calls from my mother, 23 from Lucia, and a dozen from my father. The family WhatsApp group, usually quiet except when someone needed money, had exploded with messages, most directed at me, questioning my sanity, my loyalty, my basic decency. I knew what was coming. Attempts to minimize it, to blame me, to manipulate me into retracting my statement and opening my wallet once more. I scrolled through the notifications without opening them, seeing just enough of each preview to understand their tactics. Elena, how could you say that? Everyone is shocked. Miguel's parents think we're dysfunctional now. Read one from Mom. What a shame you made us go through. Another message from Mom, sent at 3:14 a.m., likely after too much of the expensive wine I had provided for the dinner. It was a joke, Elena. Always so dramatic, came from Lucia, accompanied by rolling eye emojis, as if to emphasize how unreasonable I was being. We need to talk. Your attitude is unacceptable. From Dad, his message devoid of any acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, it was their attitude that had finally become unacceptable to me. I deleted the messages without replying. I owed them nothing, not an explanation, not an apology. The first thing I did the next day was call Sophie. Sophia is my best friend from college. She always told me, Elena, you don't owe them anything. You're building your life while they live off yours. Sophia, with her calm but firm voice, listened to my story. She showed no surprise. They did it, didn't they? I knew they would cross the line sooner or later. Her validation was like a revelation. It made me feel that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't overreacted. She gave me the first practical advice. Document everything, Elena. Every transfer, every message, every email where they ask you for money. You need to have everything in writing. I spent the next few days immersed in account statements, old emails, WhatsApp conversations. My dining table disappeared under stacks of printed papers, highlighted sections glowing neon against the white background. Each document represented a moment when I had chosen family obligation over self-preservation. It was a painful journey through the past, a recount of every time I said yes when I should have said no. Every time I transferred money without questioning the purpose. Every time I accepted vague explanations because challenging them felt disloyal. Each transfer was a pang. 20,000 pesos for Lucia's tuition at that private university she insisted on attending, even though she had scholarships for perfectly good public ones. 45,000 for the down payment on her European car when a domestics model would have served her just fine. 80,000 for Dad's dental bills because he insisted on that celebrity dentist to treat a mere toothache. 150,000 for the family trip to Cancun, where I had a room to myself but somehow ended up paying for everyone's accommodations, meals, and excursions. Looking at the bare numbers on the statements, without the emotional manipulation that typically accompanied the requests, was illuminating and devastating. Seeing the figures together was overwhelming. Column after column of outgoing transfers, each described with a quick, clinical bank label that stripped away the guilt and obligation that had prompted them. Transfer to L. Wilson, Payment Hospital, Services, Deposit Travel Agency. The totals at the bottom of each page grew increasingly alarming as I worked backward through years of financial records. It was an immense sum of money, a significant portion of what I had earned with so much effort over the years. And it was during this excavation into the past that I uncovered something that chilled me to the bone. I was searching for old emails from my parents about college expenses and stumbled upon a chain of emails from about 10 years ago between Mom, Dad, and a lawyer. They were discussing the distribution of Grandma Carmen's assets. My maternal grandmother had passed away when I was young, and they always told me she had left almost nothing. But in these emails, there was mention of a small property in a town in Jalisco and a sum of money that Grandma Carmen specifically wanted to leave to me for my future and my education. The total wasn't a fortune, but it was a considerable amount. At that time, more than enough for my college tuition. The emails detailed how Dad and Mom could quickly sell the property and redirect the money and the cash to cover some urgent debts of theirs, justifying that I was still young and didn't need that burden. They made sure I never found out. They had stolen my own inheritance. The discovery was devastating. It wasn't just that they had financially exploited me for years, extracting money with a combination of guilt, obligation, and manipulative gratitude. It was that they had lied to me and stolen something that was legitimately mine for a decade, something my grandmother had specifically intended for me. not for their credit card bills or dad's new business ventures that inevitably failed. I remembered how they had spoken about Grandma Carmen after her death. She was always frugal, Mom would say with a slight curl of her lip. Lived simply, died simply, left nothing but memories. And I had believed her. I had treasured those memories of Grandma's small kitchen filled with the scent of fresh bread, of her patient hands teaching me to embroider, of her quiet dignity that somehow never quite fit with the rest of the boisterous Hernandez family. Now I understood why she had been different. She had seen through them, perhaps. And in her final act, she had tried to give me a foundation, a start that wasn't tied to their control. The initial rage transformed into an icy determination. I printed out these emails too, creating a separate file labeled Inheritance. I added notes, dates, calculations of what that sum, properly invested, might have grown to over the past decade. This wasn't just a matter of a wedding. This was no longer about Lucia's cruel toast or my parents' laughter. It was a pattern of deception and manipulation spanning a lifetime. The calls and messages from my parents became more insistent, then more aggressive. They demanded to know if I was serious about the wedding. Lucia sent me crying voice messages, saying I was ruining her dream. Dad threatened me with legal action if I didn't fulfill our agreements. Mom was getting sick because of me. It was then that I decided I needed professional help. Following Sophia's advice and a colleague's reference, I contacted Attorney Roberts, a lawyer specializing in family and civil law. I told her my story, showed her the documentation I had gathered, and with a heavy heart, showed her the emails about my grandmother's inheritance. Attorney Roberts, a middle-aged woman with a penetrating but kind look, listened attentively. She confirmed what I feared. I had a case not only to protect myself from their threats about the wedding, but to claim my part of the stolen inheritance. And perhaps even compensation for years of unjust enrichment if we could prove that my support was involuntary, but a product of manipulation. Elena, she told me, you have been a victim of financial and emotional abuse for years. What you did when you raised your glass was an act of legitimate defense. Her words gave me immense strength. I wasn't alone anymore. I had a strategist by my side. Following Attorney Roberts' advice, I sent a formal letter to my parents and Lucia. I spent hours drafting it with the lawyer, choosing each word carefully. We decided on heavy cream stationery with my company's letterhead, a reminder of my professional success that they so easily dismissed. The letter arrived by certified mail, requiring a signature for delivery. I later learned from a sympathetic cousin that my mother's hand trembled as she signed for it, perhaps already sensing that this wasn't a typical communication from her dependable daughter. It was a cold and direct letter, not emotional, not pleading, factual and resolute with the steady voice of someone who had awakened from a long spell of manipulation. It notified them that I was withdrawing my financial support for the wedding, detailed the history of my past contributions with exact figures and dates, and mentioned in passing that I was aware of the situation with my grandmother's inheritance, and that I would seek legal advice to recover it. Attorney Roberts had suggested this approach, not leading with the inheritance issue, but including it as an aside, a warning shot across their bow. The letter wasn't a threat, it was a declaration of independence and facts. Sending that letter unleashed the real earthquake. The Hernandez family's reaction wasn't one of negotiation or understanding. It was unleashed fury, a storm of rage that confirmed everything Attorney Roberts had warned me about. When people are accustomed to controlling you, she had said during one of our meetings, her eyes serious behind stylish glasses, they react with disproportionate anger when that control is threatened. Prepare yourself. Despite her warning, the intensity of their response shocked me. Within hours of receiving the letter, the attacks began. Threats by phone, my father calling my office line repeatedly until my assistant, alarmed, asked if she should block the number. You don't know what you're doing, he growled during the one call I answered, his voice slurring slightly, suggesting he'd been drinking. You'll regret this, Elena. Family is everything. Without us, you're nothing. Text messages full of insults flooded my phone. My mother, usually so careful about appearances, sent paragraph after paragraph of vitriol, questioning everything, from my mental stability to my moral character. No wonder you're alone, one message read. Who could love someone so cold and ungrateful? Lucia alternated between tearful pleas and vicious attacks, sometimes within the same message. How can you do this to me? Followed immediately by, you've always been jealous of me, of what I have that you couldn't get. Elena has gone crazy. The money has gone to her head. She wants to ruin her own family. It was painful. Each lie, each stab in the back felt like salt in a wound. Some relatives I appreciated started to distance themselves. Mutual friends looked at me strangely. I felt that my reputation, so arduously earned, was being attacked by those who should protect me. And then came the second blow, the one that almost knocked me out. I received a message from Laura. Laura is my first cousin, almost my age. We were always a bit close, confidants at family gatherings, complaining together about the uncle's craziness and family pressure. I thought she would understand me, that she would be on my side. I had broadly told her what was happening. She sent me a message supposedly of support, asking for details. Naively, I told her more. I sent her screenshots of some of my parents' messages, venting about my pain. A couple of days later, I received a furious call from my Uncle Carl, Laura's dad. He yelled at me, repeating the lies my parents had been saying, adding insults. He mentioned things I had only told Laura. My heart sank. Laura had betrayed me. She had forwarded my messages, my vulnerable confessions, to her parents so they could pass them on to mine or use them against me. It was the second stab, but this time it came from someone who had approached pretending to be an ally. That was my lowest point. Between the threats, the defamation, Laura's betrayal, and the weight of years of pain, I felt like I was drowning again. Was all this worth it? Confronting my own blood? I locked myself in my apartment, not wanting to see anyone. The voices of my family, old and new, resonated in my head. Failure, selfish, crazy. But in the midst of darkness, I remembered Attorney Robert's voice. I remembered the indignation over the stolen inheritance. I remembered my parents' laughter at dinner. I remembered why I had started all this, not for revenge, but to recover my dignity, my self-respect, my life. I wasn't going to let them defeat me. I got up. I wiped away my tears. I contacted Attorney Roberts. I told her about Laura. She wasn't surprised. In these cases, family loyalty can be blind and cruel. She advised me on the next step. It was time for a direct confrontation, with evidence and, if possible, with witnesses who couldn't be so easily manipulated. The opportunity came unexpectedly. My great-aunt Carmen, an elderly and respected woman in the family, organized a meal. They hadn't formally invited me, but my great-aunt called me aside and said, "Elena, I know there are problems. Come to eat. I need to understand what's happening." And added, "Your parents will be there too." It was a potential trap, but also an opportunity. I decided to go. Not alone. I asked Sophia to accompany me, not as a participant but as my partner, for the meal. Someone who would simply be there and observe. Also, on Attorney Roberts' advice, I took a small folder with the most compelling evidence. The key bank transfers, copies of the emails about the inheritance, and a couple of the most offensive messages from my parents and Lucia. The meal at my great-aunt's house was tense from the beginning. My parents and Lucia were there, smiling stiffly. They looked at me with resentment. The atmosphere was oppressive, loaded with uncomfortable silences and forced conversations about trivial topics. My great-aunt, insightful, tried to smooth things over, but the hostility was palpable. After eating, my great-aunt, with her quiet authority, said, "Well, now that we've eaten, I think it's time we clear things up, don't you think? Here, we're not to fight, but to understand." My parents took the floor first. They repeated their version of events. I was ungrateful, selfish, unbalanced, wanted to ruin Lucia's wedding out of pure malice. Lucia added pitiful comments about how much it hurts that my own sister is doing this to me. It was a coordinated attack, full of falsehoods and self-pity. I felt the bile rise in my throat, but I remained serene. Sophia, sitting beside me, discreetly squeezed my hand. When they finished, my great-aunt looked at me. "Elena, what do you have to say to this?" I took a deep breath. I looked at my parents, at Lucia. The icy rage gave me strength. "I've brought some things," I said, taking out the folder. "Not to fight, as Anarman says, but to show the truth. The truth of why I reached the point of not wanting to pay for one more wedding." I began with a clear and firm voice, although my heart was beating hard against my ribs and my mouth had gone completely dry. I spoke of years of financial support. Each word felt like it was being pulled from somewhere deep inside me, from that place where I had buried all the resentment, all the hurt, all the silent fury of being used while being belittled. My voice surprisingly didn't waver as I laid out the facts of my exploitation. "You say I only have money?" I said, looking at Lucia, whose perfect makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, evidence of the strain the last few weeks had put on her. Her engagement ring glinted On her finger, a 3-carat diamond I suspected she was already calculating how to keep, even if the wedding fell through. But that money is the result of my effort. My early mornings and late nights building a business from nothing. No connections, no inheritance, just work, an effort that I used to pay for your college. I took out copies of the transfers and placed them on the table, the papers making a soft but definitive sound as they landed on the polished wood. Years of transactions, nearly 500,000 pesos in total, just for her education. To help you with your car, I pulled out more receipts. To cover Dad's unexpected expenses, more documents. Miguel's family, who was present, began to look uncomfortable. Some relatives looked on in disbelief. Then I delivered the strongest blow. And about saying that I'm ruining my family, I said, my voice breaking slightly from the pain but firm. You, Mom and Dad, robbed me. You stole my inheritance. I took out the copies of the emails from 10 years ago about Grandma Carmen's inheritance. I handed them to my great-aunt first, then offered copies to other relatives present. Grandma Carmen, my voice grew stronger, looking at my great-aunt, wanted this money to be for my education, for my future. You took it. You lied to me for 10 years. My parents' faces were a study in terror and fury. Mom was babbling denials. Dad was trying to snatch the papers from the table. Lucia was open-mouthed. And then the decisive moment occurred, the one I didn't quite expect. My great-aunt Carmen, after reading the emails, looked up with eyes full of sadness and disappointment, and looked at her nephews. It's true, she said, her voice clear and serene, but with a weight of authority that no one could ignore. I knew Carmen wanted to leave something to Elena. I asked years ago, and they told me that things had become complicated and that it hadn't been possible. I didn't know they had done this. Her testimony, from an impartial and respected person, was the final validation. The scene became chaotic. My parents yelled at my great-aunt and me, denying everything despite the evidence. Lucia began to cry hysterically, accusing me of ruining everything. The Hernandez family's respectable mask shattered in front of several witnesses. There was no remorse in their eyes, only rage because their deception had been exposed. I stood up again. I have nothing more to say. The evidence speaks for itself. I looked at my parents and Lucia one last time. I hope you find a way to finance your wedding, Lucia. And you. I looked at my parents. Prepare to hear from my lawyer about Grandma Carmen's inheritance. I left my great-aunt's house with Sophia by my side. The afternoon air felt fresh, purifying. I had trembled, I had felt fear, but in the end, I stood firm. I had told my truth and had shown the evidence. The moment of justice wasn't in a court, but in a tense dining room, in front of relatives. It was enough. The consequences for the Hernandez family were immediate and painful. Lucia's wedding was canceled. Miguel's family, upon learning of the scandal, broke off the engagement. The news spread like wildfire in the family circle. Some relatives were outraged, others simply stayed away from my parents. Their reputation took a considerable hit. They were no longer the perfect and united family they pretended to be. The money and status they valued so much were affected. They had to sell the small property they had stolen to be able to start paying debts and avoid greater legal problems over the inheritance. My path wasn't easy after that. Moving forward after such a profound family rupture never is. The Hernandez family didn't disappear from my life overnight like closing a door on a bad dream. The ties of blood, of shared history, of childhood memories, they stretch and strain, but rarely break cleanly. They continue trying to contact me, sometimes with veiled threats about what they might tell mutual friends or business connections, sometimes with guilt trips disguised as concern for my well-being. Your father's blood pressure is through the roof because of this, my mother wrote in an email 3 weeks after the confrontation. If anything happens to him, I hope you can live with yourself. My father, whose medical care I had financed, for years, apparently had no qualms about weaponizing his health against me once more. Lucia's approach changed over time. Her initial rage gave way to calculated attempts at reconciliation that have always, without fail, circled back to financial requests. I miss you, sis, began one message, only to end with, and I found this perfect small venue that would only cost half of what we were planning before. The transparency of her manipulation was almost laughable, if it weren't so deeply sad. My lawyer took care of sending them formal communications establishing clear boundaries. I had to learn to say no and not feel guilty. The attacks on social media decreased when some relatives began to defend my version or simply ask for the gossip to stop. The healing process was long, The pain from the betrayal doesn't completely disappear, it transforms. I had to mourn the family I idealized, the one that never truly existed. I understood that blood ties don't guarantee love, respect, or loyalty. I had to forgive myself for having allowed them to treat me that way for so long, for having those blind spots out of love or need for approval. I found my true family elsewhere, in Sophia, whose unwavering friendship was my anchor, in my great-aunt Carmen, who showed me that integrity exists, in colleagues and friends who supported me. I built relationships based on mutual respect, honesty, and unconditional support, things I never had in my original home. I learned the invaluable value of personal boundaries. Setting boundaries isn't rejecting people, it's protecting oneself. It's a fundamental act of self-respect. Recovering a part of my grandmother's inheritance was less about the money and more about the principle, about the validation that they had robbed me. It was a small legal victory that closed a chapter. Today, 3 years after that dinner, I live in peace. My apartment has been redecorated. All traces of the Hernandez family aesthetic removed and replaced with colors and textures that bring me joy. The family photos, once prominently displayed, are now stored in a box in my closet, not thrown away, but no longer defining my space. I've created a sanctuary that reflects the woman I've become, not the daughter I was trained to be. My business thrives beyond what I could have imagined. Without the constant drain of supporting my family's lifestyle, I've been able to reinvest in my company, expand our services, and hire talented staff who share my vision. We now handle events for international clients, and last year, a prestigious magazine featured our work on their cover, an achievement that went unacknowledged by the Hernandez family but was celebrated with champagne and dancing by the people who truly value me. I have healthy relationships now, friendships and romantic connections built on mutual respect rather than obligation. I've even started dating someone, a kind, successful architect who sees my independence as a strength, not a failure. Having navigated his own complex family history with him, I'm learning what it feels like to be valued for who I am, not what I can provide. I still feel a pang of sadness sometimes, thinking about what could have been, but that sadness is small compared to the freedom I gained. I'm not the failure. I'm a survivor. I'm resilient. I'm the owner of my life and my dignity. The Hernandez family story is a warning, I believe, an example of how greed, control, and a lack of real love can destroy ties that are supposed to be unbreakable. My story is a reminder that sometimes to find oneself, one must have the courage to separate from those who diminish us, no matter who they are. True family isn't always one of blood. It's the one you choose, the one that respects you, the one that loves you for who you are, not for what you have or what you do for them. Looking back, I don't regret raising that glass. It was the act that freed me. The price was high, yes, but freedom is priceless. Thank you from the heart for accompanying me this far. I would really like to know what you felt when hearing my story. Did it resonate with you in any way? Have you ever experienced a similar situation with your family? Share your thoughts and emotions in the comments. I read everything,